Hello, folks. As you have seen in the news recently, the US under President Trump has imposed tariffs on several countries that it trades with. So, just so we can understand what Trump's strategy would be or end goal would be in recent times, it makes sense to look at history and look at what kind of trade wars have existed in the past, why they started, and what was the result of them. So today I want to highlight three specific instances of this. So let's dive into it. So the first example I want to highlight is the US-Japan trade war in the 1980s. So just to give you some background, the US had a major trade deficit of about $50 billion with Japan. And they were accusing Japan of using protectionist policies by providing subsidies to companies to foster domestic industries. So in 1981, the US imposed export restraints on Japanese automakers. And this eventually led to those automakers opening up manufacturing facilities in the US. Another thing the US accused Japan was of devaluing its currency, which eventually resulted in the Plaza Accord being signed, which allowed the US dollar to be devalued against Japan, hence making US exports cheaper to the Japanese market. And then lastly, the US accused Japan of dumping semiconductors in the US market at or below cost. And this eventually led to the US Japan Semiconductor Agreement being signed in 1986. However, Japan failed to comply with this agreement, which led Ronald Reagan to impose 100% tariffs on Japanese semiconductors, which eventually led them to start selling at fair value prices. So, the next example I want to highlight is the US EU trade war in the 2000s. So, basically, the US steel industry was facing a lot of financial difficulties, and there were a lot more suppliers globally for steel. So in 2002, President Bush imposed 30% tariffs on steel imports. And EU retaliated by imposing tariffs on US exports up to 2.2 billion US dollars. At the same time, they also filed a complaint against the US at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization looked at this case and eventually they concluded that the US steel tariffs were violating the global trade agreement. So eventually in 2003, the US agreed to remove these steel tariffs. The third example I want to highlight is the US China trade war, which happened under President Trump's first term back in 2018. So the US had a major trade deficit of about $375 billion with China. And the US was accusing China of using protectionist policies by providing subsidies to local companies and even stealing intellectual property from foreign companies operating in China. So Trump actually imposed 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of goods from China. And China actually retaliated with tariffs on US soybeans, cars, and aircraft. In response, in 2019, President Trump raised these tariffs to 25% on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. And again, China retaliated with tariffs on $60 billion worth of US goods. And the US restricted Huawei from buying US technology products. Eventually, all of this led to the US and China signing a trade deal in 2020, where China agreed to buy $200 billion worth of US goods, and the US agreed to reduce some tariffs. Looking at these three examples, we can see that every situation is different. There's a lot of factors that go into a trade war happening and the potential outcome. It depends on how big these two trading partners are, what kind of leverage they have, how do they see each other. If one country is potentially trading in an unfair manner, how much are they protecting their domestic economy. All right, guys, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.